March 24th, 1961, was the day. It was cool in Keystone Islands, North Miami. The 32-year-old Frances Dimare called the Miami-Dade police a little after 3 a.m. She said that 2 unidentified attackers had killed her 52-year-old husband, Joseph Demari. Who attacked and killed Joseph? And why? Was this a premeditated murder or a violent accident? Today, we're examining Joseph Demari's bizarre 62-year-old cold case, which was solved in 2023. North Miami is a suburb of Miami-Dade County, Florida, in the United States. There are little more than 60,000 people living there. North Miami experienced a significant presence of organized crime during the 1950s and 1960s, with several mafia families operating there. During this time, the mafia, also known as La Casa Nostra, exerted tremendous control over the city's underworld. The Dimares were also at their height in North Miami during this time. Joseph J. Demari, who was born in 1910, was raised in Boston alongside his brothers Dominic and Joseph. He and his brothers had a tight relationship that persisted into adulthood. The 3 brothers established a company selling fresh produce in 1928. Beginning with a pushcart, they subsequently launched a store in Boston. In 1930, as their business expanded, they relocated to a larger space in Quincy Market. Their company was national by 1939. To meet the demands of retail chains, the Demari brothers partnered with tomato producers in other states, including Florida, Texas, and California. Additionally, they were the first in New England to import tomatoes straight from Cuba, guaranteeing a continuous supply for their clients. The brothers made the decision to engage in farming as their firm prospered. In Florida and then in California, they began growing tomatoes in open packing facilities. They spread out to several areas, like South Carolina. Joseph married Josephine, who was only 2 years his junior, in 1937. Joseph, Josephine, and their 3 children, Joseph Jr., James, and Richard, moved from Boston to North Miami in the early 1940s, where Joseph and his brothers had established a successful fresh produce business. Before relocating to Keystone Island in North Miami, Joseph Demari resided in Miami Beach. Linda, Joseph's sole child, was born in 1953. Sadly, Josephine, his devoted wife, died of breast cancer shortly after, in 1956. Joseph Demari married Frances, a woman who was 20 years his junior, 3 years later, in 1959. In order to prevent frost in tomato plant rows in the late 1950s, farmers had to light kerosene lamps and place them between the rows. In order to prevent their crops from freezing, Richard recalled his father, rousing them up and escorting them to the fields. Before the tomato plants were shipped to processing, Joseph and his 3 boys would drive into farms and tend to them. In order to discuss the potential of Frances and Joseph obtaining a divorce and to update his father's will, who was 52 years old at the time, Richard, then 21 years old, drove to Ohio in March 1961 to meet with his brothers and business associates. Frances, his stepmother, did not then reside with them. Joseph Demari frequently traveled throughout the United States and Latin America while managing various areas of the company from his home in Miami. His sons lived on the family farm near Bradenton in 1961, while he and his new wife, Frances, resided in the Keystone Point house together with Joseph's daughter. But none of them could have anticipated what was going to happen. On March 24, 1961, a chilly winter night in Bradenton, Richard and his 2 brothers were sound asleep on their father's farm around 3 in the morning. However, Frances Demari called the police in a panic and gave them a terrifying account at the same time. She claimed that she had left the Keystone Point house with Joseph and gone out to dinner. Joseph sat next to Frances as they drove off for supper in their Cadillac Fleetwood, which she had taken the wheel of. Just west of the wide causeway, at a crossroads close to Keystone Point South exit, they came to a stop. 2 males leaped into their automobile out of nowhere, causing commotion. Frances was forced to drive to a vacant lot in San Souci Estates by one of the men while he held a gun forcibly to the back of her head. When Joseph turned to look, the pistol was savagely fired into his face. Frances yelled and was struck as well. Frances was struck with the gun, rendering her unconscious. She was awakened to see Joseph dead in the seat next to her and the murderers running away. She hurried through the shrubs and brambles to a Phillips 66 gas station nearby in a fit of terror. She made the police call from that point on. The first officer on the scene was North Miami Police Department Patrolman Ben Scola. Frances didn't appear to be seriously hurt, according to his observation of her at the petrol station. Her face is scratched, and there are a few blood stains on her clothes. It appeared as though she had rubbed her hands down her face to cause the marks. Frances informed him that she had been unconscious or knocked out and was unable to witness the shooting. Shell casings were found in the Cadillac's rear seat during the inquiry. A closer look at the photos revealed that there were also at least 2 unfired cartridges in the back seat. Norman Logan, a gas station clerk, allegedly told investigators that Frances didn't mention her husband being shot until the cops showed up. 2 adjacent fishermen asserted that they were oblivious to the incident. Frances told the police that the attackers stole $400 in cash from her husband and $5,000 worth of jewelry from her. The gold ring and diamond cufflinks were nonetheless discovered on her husband's body, despite the robbery. The Miami Herald reported that a day after the murder and theft, Frances said the gunman seized her jewels by force. She disregarded the command not to turn back, and one of the bandits shot her in the head with his revolver, knocking her out. She had told the police that her spouse had turned around. According to the article, when Frances regained consciousness, a few minutes later, the attackers had left and her husband was slumped against the car door, bleeding from his head. She quickly made her way through the thorny thorns, jagged rocks, and brambles to the nearest Phillips 66 gas station, where she quickly dialed the police for help. Frances later admitted, in an interview with the Miami Herald following the murder, that the killers, for some reason, called her husband Frank rather than Joe. She guessed that perhaps they thought Joe was someone else. When the police spoke to her about the murder, they had not received this information either. According to other press accounts from the time, Frances recalled how the shooter struck her with the weapon after she grew upset as they were trying to seize her jewelry. She passed out as a result, and when she came to, she saw that her husband had been shot. Again, Frances did not disclose the hysterical aspect of this to the police during their interview with her. It was stated in another Herald article that Frances arrived at the gas station and told Norman Logan, the owner's son, that the 2 men had entered the car, one in the back and one in the front. But Norman made it clear to the police that Frances had not brought up the murder until they arrived at the gas station on the night of the murder. The way Frances described the shootout and the murder scene had several inconsistencies. Was this a result of pressure she was under from someone? Joseph's brothers were completely absent from the scene while this was going on. Did they have something to hide? The reason for Joseph's death, which the authorities extensively investigated at the time, was so that the Demari firm would now only be split between the 2 surviving brothers. But Frances wasn't finished yet. The following week, she gave the Herald another exclusive interview in which she repeated the incidents. This time, she stated that 2 males unexpectedly climbed into the rear seat of the vehicle as they approached the Causeway Bayshore crossing. There was no other traffic on the causeway, but a car was following. Frances was in control of the vehicle when one of the men told her to follow their directions precisely, while holding a pistol to the back of her head. She was instructed to travel straight to San Souci Estates. They told her to turn right off Bayshore Drive after traveling for around 1 block. Her husband, Joe, was curious and asked the men what they wanted. One of the attackers retaliated by saying they wanted his money. Joe kept turning back, trying to fight them, but they insisted that Frances and Joe keep their heads forward. On one occasion, he turned and was struck hard in the face. Frances noticed that he was bleeding when he turned to face her. He soon turned around again, and when they struck him again, Frances screamed in retaliation. The assailants then struck her twice in the head. She was found unconscious on the gravel outside the automobile when she came to. She had lost all of her jewelry, which was worth about $5,000. At the time, Joe had about $400 in cash, which she later learned had also been stolen. Frances was certain that the men were professionals. Their calm, methodical approach convinced her that they had experience. She couldn't get a good look at them, but their speech did not sound like that of hoodlums. Frances was unable to shake the feeling that a major error had been made because the men kept referring to her husband as Frank rather than Joe for no apparent reason. She stated that she thought they might have thought Joe was someone else, or maybe their main goal was just robbery. She didn't think that they were trying to hurt anyone. Now that she had given interviews to newspapers, Frances logically addressed all the areas that did not line up with her police testimonies. But why did she continue to support her claims? It was evident that she wouldn't remember everything exactly if she suffered a concussion as a result of the knock to the head. What was more intriguing, though, was that she was also justifying the attackers, claiming that they might have thought Joseph was someone else, and that their main motivation was only robbery, not murder. As a result, the authorities made the assumption that the murderer might have been someone close to Joseph and Frances. The authorities were unable to collect any DNA samples or even fingerprints that would have allowed them to identify the killers back then because technology was not very advanced. No one saw the murderers, and they escaped before Frances became conscious, so there were no more hints. Thus, the case eventually became unsolved. However, Richard, Joseph's son, recalled that Frances and Joseph had some issues before Joseph was killed. Frances wasn't living with Joseph at the time of the murder, and Richard arranged a conference with the other family members to discuss his father's will and his divorce from her. She was on her way to Ohio. When she learned that Joseph had modified his will, she returned. As it stands, Frances would only be entitled to a portion of his fortune if she cohabited with Joseph for the duration of their marriage. Richard said that Frances did not even cry on the day of Joseph's funeral. She had a deadpan expression that was unmatched. She was more concerned with doing her hair than really attending the funeral. Despite the fact that she claimed to have received a blow to the forehead from the pistol's butt, there were no signs of any wounds on her forehead. Following the funeral, Frances gave the children of Joseph a 24-hour notice to vacate, and she was given $250,000 from Joseph's estate. And a few weeks following Joseph's funeral, Frances married a new husband. Unexpectedly, he was the lawyer who would defend Frances in her divorce proceedings. Nearly 2 decades later, in the 1980s, Richard reopened his investigation into the case with the aid of volunteer Paul Novak and an attorney. Novak was familiar with the crimes that took place in and around Miami. Novak suggested to Richard, after much thought, that he send the case to a forensic scientist. In the 1960s, there was a lot of organized crime in Miami, and many of the crimes were connected to one another, as Novak was aware. Novak and Richard reasoned that since Joseph was a successful businessman, this might be a mafia hit. Nearly 30 years after Joseph's passing, in 1991, Richard Demari noticed another angle on the situation. He asked University of California professor of forensic science John Thornton for a second perspective. Thornton expressed his skepticism about Frances' claims in a letter to the Miami-Dade police after analyzing the case. She recounted a scenario that didn't seem to fit the gunshot wounds, which appeared to have been fired from 2 separate directions. Thornton further emphasized that the blood found at the crime scene did not match the length of time Frances said the incident transpired. However, there was no evidence, so the police were unable to take it into account. A high-ranking official had instructed the police not to look into Frances because she was widowed, grieving, and a victim. So the police did not further investigate Frances' potential involvement during the initial investigation, a different police officer at the time revealed. And they never again questioned her. Then, in the year 2000, some policemen arrived with a list of potential suspects. Some 40 years later, Joseph's murder was one of the earlier crimes that the police department was investigating. Frances was not among the suspects on the list Richard had compiled after conducting his own research. Frances Demari passed away in 2006. She was 82 years old. She had 4 previous marriages, including her union with Joseph Demari. In 2019, nearly 60 years after Joseph Demari's murder and 20 years after Frances' passing, Paul Novick and the Homicide Squad of the Cold Case Squad of the Miami-Dade Police Department reopened the Joseph Demari cold case file. They discovered a lot of hints about the probe in the older police reports. First, Richard had given the police some shell casings after his father was killed. These bullet shells originated from a .25 caliber SATA, an Italian auto handgun that Joseph possessed but kept close by Frances. The cartridge casings from the shots Richard personally fired with the gun into their home's swimming pool were found. However, why did Richard give the police these casings? Because the shot casings found in Joseph's automobile when he was killed matched those found in these casings. When the deceased was discovered, there were still 2 empty rounds there. The inquiry by the police revealed that Joseph had been shot 4 times. From the front, 2 bullets were fired right into his mouth. The 2 additional shots were fired from the left side, striking his left ear's area in front of and behind it. Due to the near proximity of the gunfire, there are still signs of gunpowder around the wounds. This suggested that a person who was physically very close to Joseph had murdered him. The fact that he had injuries to his mouth and the area surrounding his left ear indicated that the attackers weren't in the back seat, indicating that the person who shot him through the mouth as well as his left side, proving that Joseph was dead. Joseph had 9 cuts or bruises on his skull, in addition to the gunshot wounds. He also showed bruising on his right index finger and left arm, indicating that Joseph either struggled before being shot or was dragged after being shot. Both the front and back seats of the car, as well as the outside, were covered with blood. Blood trickled out of the bottom of the door and down the window. It was confirmed once more that no blood was found on the driver's seat, steering wheel, or driver's door after a re-examination in late 2019. Additionally, no blood splatter was discovered outside of the front seat's center. This implied that Frances, who was seated in the driver's seat, had not sustained any injuries. Streaks of blood were seen traveling rearward across the car's exterior. The quantity of blood revealed the severity of the injuries and the length of time it took for bleeding to start following the gunshot. As a result, the car continued to go even after Joseph had been wounded and was bleeding. Again, this went against what Frances had indicated. The automobile could not have continued to move after that because she claimed to have fallen asleep behind the wheel. In Joseph's lungs, there was no blood. On his jaw, nevertheless, there was a small redness. Medical professionals hypothesized that these findings would indicate that when Joseph was shot, someone had their arm around his neck, obstructing his airway. Alternatively, it can imply that the deadly shot immediately stopped the victim's respiration. Frances said it was a robbery, although Joseph's gold ring and diamond cufflinks were still on him when he was found in the car. No gunshots, signs of a struggle, or even a bullet being fired were heard by 2 men who were nearby fishing. Frances didn't have any injuries to her feet, and her shoes were discovered close to the automobile in a way that suggested they were placed there on purpose rather than randomly. Frances claimed to have walked barefoot from the automobile to the gas station, and when a female deputy reenacted the incident, her feet suffered many cuts and bruises. Norman Logan, the first person Frances spoke to at the petrol station, claimed she never brought up her husband's being shot. The greatest blows, however, were still to come. Ballistic tests were conducted by the police and Novick, who discovered that the trajectory of the gunshots found at the crime scene could only be explained if the round was fired from the driver's side. It did not follow the path of the gunshots that Frances had stated in her earlier claims. Additionally, the .25 caliber SATA gun used to kill Joseph was the same one that had vanished from the Demari home on the day Joseph went out with Frances for the final time. It was determined by the police that the shell casings Richard gave them were identical to the bullets used to kill Joseph. The blood trail that was discovered from Joseph's garage, heading to the area where Joseph's Cadillac was parked, was the most eye-opening detail in the case reports, though. This made it very evident that Joseph had in fact been shot in his garage while at home with Frances before they even left for supper. Now, Novak and the homicide squad detectives were aware that Frances could only inherit Joseph's estate if she remained by his side throughout their marriage. And that is what took place. Frances received the $250,000 because she was married to Joseph until he passed away. The police came to the conclusion that Frances had a good enough reason to kill Joseph and rob him of his money because of the divorce issue and Joseph's will. This was sufficient evidence for the authorities to draw the conclusion that only one individual could have committed all of these crimes, in addition to all the other clear cues. That person was Frances Dimare. The Miami-Dade Homicide and Cold Case Squad held a press conference on May 10, 2023, almost 3 years following the reopening of the Joseph Demari cold case. She was worried that if she didn't remain in the married residence, she might be excluded from the will. We are aware that she was not in Miami at the time of the murder, and that she returned after learning this. In that, they declared that they had solid evidence to support their theory that Frances Dimare murdered Joseph Demari. The anticipated divorce and Joseph's modification of the will served as justifications for her murder.
There were concerns that she had that she would be out of the will if she wasn't living in the marital home. We know that she wasn't in Miami prior to the homicide, and that when she found that out, she did travel back.
She did this by shooting Joseph in the garage of their home, then moving the vehicle 3 or 4 miles away, leaving Joseph's body inside the vehicle while she walked barefoot to the gas station and dialed 911. Additionally, according to the authorities, Frances threw the .25 caliber SATA pistol beneath a bridge, which is why the murder weapon was never discovered. Richard, who is now 82, said that although he was relieved after hearing this news, he was not at all delighted. His stepmother was the murderer, and he knew it. Richard also disclosed that he had asked the police to look into Frances in 1961 because he believed she was the murderer, but they had declined. There were numerous issues. 3 times, my stepmother had left the house. When I informed them that my stepmother had carried out the shooting in 1961, they responded, "Oh no, Mr. Demari, she wasn't the shooter." On the one hand, I'm relieved, but I'm not sure if the anguish and suffering endured by my family will ever end. Because Frances passed away in 2006, she was unable to face justice for her crimes. She had lived a whole life without ever having to answer for her choices. According to Novak, this case is only one illustration of how politics may trump justice. It is still unknown who the senior official was who gave Frances the order for the cops to leave him alone. Since then, the Demari Company has expanded greatly, especially globally. The Demari companies continue to preserve the principles of diligence, honesty, and quality set out by the brothers, according to their websites. They think that the subsequent generations of the Demari family and their devoted staff will carry on their tenacity and resilience. These principles had an impact on Richard as well, who kept fighting for his father's rights. And even though his stepmother will never receive justice, he can find some solace in the knowledge that she was responsible. Why do you think the original investigations did not focus more on Frances? Do you believe that a wider plot was concealed? Please share your opinions with us in the comment area. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share. Please leave a comment if you have a case you'd like us to cover. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.